A first-class ticket isn't just a seat, it's a statement. But for Dr. Julian Hayes, it became the fuse for an explosive confrontation at 30,000 feet. On a routine flight from New York to Los Angeles, a wealthy passenger's sneering disbelief at a black man sitting in luxury spirals into a shocking display of prejudice, backed by the very flight crew sworn to serve. They judged his clothes, questioned his ticket, and tried to humiliate him. They had no idea they weren't just disrespecting a passenger. They were challenging the most powerful man in their entire company. This is the story of how one man's quiet dignity in the face of ugly bias led to an earthquake that shattered careers and reshaped a billion-dollar airline from the inside out. The hum of New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport was a familiar symphony to Dr. Julian Hayes. It was a chaotic orchestra of rolling suitcases, hurried announcements, and the low murmur of 1,000 intersecting lives. At 52, Julian wore his success, not like a flashy suit of armor, but like a well-worn, comfortable coat. His salt-and-pepper beard was neatly trimmed, and his attire a simple dark grey Henley-tailored travel slacks, and a pair of unassuming but high-quality leather sneakers spoke of a man who valued comfort and quality over ostentatious branding. He carried a worn leather satchel, its surface softened with the patina of countless journeys, containing not much more than a laptop, a notebook, and a well-read copy of a Marcus Aurelius classic. He was flying Global Air Flight 287 non-stop from JFK to LAX, first class. The ticket had been booked by the company he was about to lead a final quiet journey before his official announcement as the new chairman of the board. No one knew yet. To the world and to everyone in this terminal, he was just another traveler. This anonymity was a small luxury he was savoring for the last time. He had spent his career in the demanding world of corporate restructuring, a surgeon for ailing companies known for his incisive intellect and unwavering calm. He'd turned around tech firms, revitalized manufacturing giants, and now he was tasked with steering one of the world's largest airlines back to a position of prestige and, more importantly, profitability. As he approached the dedicated first-class boarding lane, he noticed a man ahead of him, holding court with the gate agent. The man, probably in his late 50s, was dressed in a way that screamed money. A crisp monogrammed shirt, a gold watch that caught the fluorescent lights with every gesticulation, and a voice that carried an unmistakable tone of entitlement. This was Richard Sterling, a name Julian would soon learn. "Honestly, Rebecca," Richard was saying to the gate agent, his voice a condescending drawl. "The standards are just slipping, absolutely slipping. You let anyone through these days." He gestured vaguely at the general boarding area, a look of distaste on his face. Rebecca, the gate agent, offered a practiced, tight-lipped smile. "We value all our customers, Mr. Sterling." Julian took his place in line behind him. When Richard turned, his eyes swept over Julian in a fraction of a second, but it was a look that communicated volumes. It was a quick, dismissive appraisal from the simple Henley to the travel-worn satchel, and the conclusion was instantaneous. "He doesn't belong here." "Excuse me," Richard said, his tone not asking but demanding. "I think you might be in the wrong line. Economy boarding is over there." He pointed with a flick of his wrist towards the much longer snaking queue. Julian met the man's gaze, his expression unreadable. "I believe I'm in the right place, thank you." A smirk played on Richard's lips. "Oh, really? This is Priority Group 1. First class." He emphasized the words as if explaining a complex concept to a child. "Easy mistake to make." "Not a mistake," Julian replied, his voice even and low. He held up his boarding pass, the bold first clearly visible. Richard Sterling squinted at it, his brows furrowing in genuine comical disbelief. He leaned in closer, as if the print might be a forgery. "Well, I'll be." Upgrades, I suppose, must have a lot of miles. The implication was clear. There was no other conceivable way a man like Julian could have acquired such a seat. The jab was designed to diminish to place him in a box of someone who'd gotten lucky, a recipient of corporate charity. Julian didn't rise to the bait. He simply said something like that, and turned his attention back to the gate, a silent dismissal. The slight, however, hung in the air a tiny venomous dart. It wasn't the overt, headline-grabbing racism he'd encountered in his youth. It was something more insidious, the quiet, reflexive prejudice of a man who saw the world through a narrow, gilded keyhole, a world where black men in simple clothes didn't belong in his exclusive spaces unless they were there to serve. Rebecca, the gate agent who had witnessed the entire exchange, quickly scanned Julian's pass with a forced, bright smile. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Hayes. Enjoy your flight." She pointedly used his title, perhaps, as a small act of defiance against Sterling's boorishness. The title seemed to momentarily surprise Sterling, but he recovered quickly. As Julian walked down the jet bridge, Sterling fell into step beside him. "Dr. A doctor of what I wonder. Let me guess. Sociology, grievance studies." Julian stopped for a brief moment under the hum of the jet bridge lights. He turned to face the man fully. "Economics," he said, his voice as calm as a placid lake. "Specifically the study of how mismanaged, arrogant corporate cultures lead to catastrophic failure. It's quite fascinating." He then continued on, leaving Richard Sterling standing there, a flicker of confusion and irritation crossing his face, before he scoffed and followed Julian onto the aircraft, determined to have the last word. The doors of the plane hissed shut, sealing them all inside a pressurized cabin that was about to become a crucible. The first-class cabin of the Global Air 777 was an oasis of beige leather and muted tones designed to soothe the nerves of the world's elite. Julian settled into seat 2A, a spacious pod by the window. He was looking forward to 5 hours of uninterrupted work, a chance to review the final internal audits before his official start. He placed his satchel under the seat in front of him and was about to retrieve his laptop when Richard Sterling arrived, huffing slightly as he stowed his designer carry-on in the overhead bin. His seat, Julian noted with a sense of grim inevitability, was 2C directly across the aisle. Sterling didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he stood there, casting a long shadow over Julian's seat. He flagged down a passing flight attendant, a woman with blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a name tag that read, "Mia." "Mia, darling," Sterling said, his voice, once again, loud enough for the entire front cabin to hear. "There seems to be a bit of a mix-up with the seating. I was under the impression this cabin was fully booked with our usual clientele." He glanced meaningfully at Julian. Mia, a veteran of 20 years, had a sixth sense for placating her high-value customers. She recognized Richard Sterling instantly. He was a Global Diamond member, a frequent flyer known for being demanding and a prodigious tipper. Her professional smile clicked into place. "Mr. Sterling, welcome back. Is there an issue with your seat?" she asked, her focus entirely on him, pointedly ignoring Julian. "My seat is fine," Sterling clarified, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was still perfectly audible. "It's that seat I'm concerned about. I just want to ensure there hasn't been an error. Perhaps a passenger from the back wandered up here by mistake. It happens." The accusation was now direct and public. A few other passengers already settled with their pre-departure. Champagne began to look over their curiosity, piqued. Julian slowly looked up from his seat, his gaze meeting Mia's. "There is no mistake," he said calmly. "This is my assigned seat." Mia's eyes flickered towards Julian, her smile tightening. Her allegiance was clear. In her calculus, a complaining Diamond member outweighed an unknown passenger in a Henley. "Sir," she began, her tone patronizing. "I'm sure we can clear this up. Could I just see your boarding pass again, please?" It was a test. It was a demand for credentials. The same one he had faced at the gate, now repeated with an audience. With deliberate slowness, Julian reached into his jacket, retrieved the pass, and handed it to her. He didn't say a word, letting the silence amplify the absurdity of the situation. Mia glanced at it. "Dr. J. Hayes, seat 2A. She handed it back, her expression a mixture of annoyance and surprise. The validation did nothing to deter Sterling. "A doctor." Sterling scoffed, settling into his seat with a theatrical sigh. These days they hand out doctorates like candy. "My point, Mia, is about the ambiance, the integrity of the first-class experience. We pay a significant premium for a certain level of comfort and exclusivity." The dog whistle was now a foghorn. Julian felt a familiar, weary anger begin to coil in his stomach, but his expression remained a mask of placid neutrality. He had faced men like Sterling across boardroom tables his entire life. Their tactics were always the same: belittle question and other to gain the upper hand. "Sir," Julian said, his voice cutting through Sterling's monologue, firm and clear. "My ticket was paid for just like yours. I am entitled to be here just like you. I would appreciate it if you would direct your concerns elsewhere and allow me to enjoy my flight." "Entitled?" Sterling shot back, his face reddening. "That's rich. I'm a paying customer who has logged over 2 million miles with this airline." "Who are you?" "Someone who used a one-time voucher." Mia, seeing the situation escalating, decided to intervene on Sterling's behalf. She leaned towards Julian, her voice low and syrupy sweet. "So perhaps we can find you another equally comfortable seat. Maybe one with a bit more privacy." She offered, gesturing vaguely towards the rear of the small first-class cabin. It was a thinly veiled suggestion for him to move, to concede, to make the real first-class passenger comfortable. "No, thank you," Julian said, his eyes locking onto hers. "This seat is perfectly fine. I am not the one causing a disturbance." The direct refusal seemed to stun Mia. She was used to passengers who would acquiesce, especially when confronted by a superior-feeling flight attendant and a VIP customer. Her sweet facade began to crack. "Sir, I'm just trying to ensure a pleasant flight for everyone." "Then I suggest you ask Mr. Sterling to lower his voice and mind his own business," Julian replied, turning his attention to the window as the plane began to push back from the gate. It was a clear signal the conversation was over. But for Richard Sterling, it was a challenge he couldn't ignore. Humiliated and enraged by Julian's unflappable composure, he unbuckled his seatbelt, a clear violation of cabin rules, as the plane was now taxiing. He stood up, leaning over the aisle. "Now you listen to me," he snarled, jabbing a finger in Julian's direction. "I don't know who you think you are, but you will show me some respect." Mia rushed over. "Mr. Sterling, please sit down. We're on an active taxiway." The scene had now devolved into a full-blown spectacle. The other passengers were openly staring. A younger man in seat 1A was discreetly filming the interaction on his phone. Julian remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the man towering over him. The calm in his eyes seemed to infuriate Sterling even more. He was losing control, and in his world that was the ultimate sin. "I am trying to have a conversation." "Mia," Sterling insisted, his voice rising. "This man is being belligerent." It was then that another crew member, the lead flight attendant, a stern-looking woman named Maria, arrived from the galley. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her eyes taking in the scene. "This passenger is harassing Dr. Hayes." The young man in 1A spoke up unexpectedly. "He's been doing it since we boarded. Mia shot the young man a venomous glare. "I have the situation under control, Maria. Mr. Sterling was just feeling uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable?" Julian finally spoke again, his voice dangerously quiet. "That's what we're calling it." Maria looked from the furious Sterling to the composed Julian, and then to the flustered Mia. She knew this was beyond a simple passenger squabble. This was something that could have serious repercussions. "Mia, take care of Mr. Sterling. I need to inform the captain." Maria's words, "inform the captain," hung in the air with the weight of an anchor dropping. In the hermetically sealed world of a commercial airliner involving the flight deck was the ultimate escalation. It meant the situation had surpassed the crew's ability to manage and was now a potential security or safety issue. Richard Sterling, hearing this, finally seemed to realize he had overplayed his hand. A flicker of concern crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by righteous indignation. He sank back into his seat, fastening his seatbelt with a loud, aggressive click, and folded his arms, adopting the posture of a deeply wronged man. Mia, meanwhile, was in damage control mode, but her every action was geared toward mollifying Sterling. She leaned over him, murmuring apologies, and offering him another drink, which he accepted with a curt nod. She never once made eye contact with Julian. To her, the problem was not Sterling's behavior, but Julian's refusal to be intimidated by it. A few minutes later, as the aircraft paused in a queue for takeoff, the cabin door to the flight deck opened. Captain Frank Marshall emerged. He was the picture of authority, tall, silver-haired with a crisp pilot's uniform and an air of weary command. He had been flying for 30 years, and his face was a roadmap of long hauls and delayed departures. He had a low tolerance for drama in the cabin. Maria met him at the front galley, speaking in low, urgent tones and gesturing back towards aisle 2. Captain Marshall listened, his expression hardening. He walked into the first-class cabin, his eyes sweeping over the passengers, before landing on the 2 men at the center of the conflict. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said, his voice calm, but with an undeniable edge of steel. "I'm Captain Marshall. I understand there's been some sort of misunderstanding." Sterling immediately launched into his version of events. "Captain, thank you for coming out. It's frankly appalling. I was simply making an inquiry about a potential seating error, and this gentleman," he said the word with dripping sarcasm, became incredibly hostile and disruptive. Frankly, I don't feel entirely safe. It was a masterful, if despicable, performance. Sterling was painting himself as the victim and Julian as the aggressor. Captain Marshall turned his gaze to Julian. It was not a hostile gaze, but it was laden with the weight of unconscious bias. He saw a well-dressed, established-looking white man, a known 2-million-miler, and a black man in casual attire who was, according to the initial report, the source of the disruption. His professional training screamed, "De-escalate," but his ingrained assumptions were already coloring his judgment. "Sir," he said to Julian, his tone professional, yet subtly accusatory. "My lead attendant tells me you were asked to verify your seat, and you refused a suggestion to move." Julian met the captain's eyes without blinking. "Captain, your lead attendant is misinformed. I verified my seat for the flight attendant, Mia, and I declined her suggestion to move because I am not the one causing a problem. Mr. Sterling has been harassing me since the boarding gate, questioning my right to be in this cabin based on assumptions he is making about my race. He then unbuckled his seatbelt and stood over me in a threatening manner while we were on an active taxiway. Any disruption here was created by him." He delivered the statement with the precision of a lawyer's closing argument, calm, factual, and damning. The young man in 1A, emboldened, spoke up again. "It's true, Captain. I saw the whole thing. The other guy started it." Captain Marshall was now in a difficult position. He had conflicting reports, but one of the parties was a high-value customer who flew this route weekly, and the other was an unknown. Airlines train their staff to solve problems with minimal fuss, and the path of least resistance was clear. "Look, Dr. Hayes," Marshall said, his voice shifting to one of weary conciliation. "I don't care who started it. What I care about is getting 300 people to Los Angeles, safely and on time. We're about to take off. I need this to end. Now." He paused, then made his decision. "To keep the peace, I'm going to ask you one more time. There is an empty seat in row 4. It's still first class. I would appreciate it if you would move there." It was no longer a suggestion. It was a command from the highest authority on the aircraft. But it was a command rooted in a deep injustice. He was asking the victim of the harassment to move, to be the one to concede, simply to pacify the aggressor. It was the easy way out, and in that moment Julian saw the entire culture of the airline encapsulated in that one simple, deeply biased request. A profound silence fell over the cabin. Everyone was watching Julian, waiting for his response. Would he submit to the captain's authority, or would he stand his ground? Julian slowly shook his head. "No, Captain," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I will not be moving. I will not be punished for another man's prejudice. You are the captain of this aircraft. Your responsibility is to deal with the disruptive passenger, not to displace the one being targeted. If Mr. Sterling feels unsafe, I'm sure you can find him another seat in a different cabin. Perhaps economy. Plus." The sheer audacity of the refusal left Captain Marshall momentarily speechless. He was not used to being defied. His face flushed with anger. Sterling across the aisle let out a triumphant "Ha!" as if Julian had just sealed his own fate. "Sir," Captain Marshall said, his voice now dangerously low, "you are interfering with a flight crew. That is a federal offense. You can move to seat 4D, or I can have you removed from this aircraft right now. We can easily return to the gate." Julian looked at the captain, then at Mia's smug expression, and finally at Richard Sterling, who was now smirking openly. He saw a system closing ranks to protect its own, to protect the status quo. He had wanted a quiet flight, a last moment of anonymity. But they had forced his hand. He let out a long, slow breath. "Captain Marshall," he said, his voice taking on a new tone, one of quiet authority that seemed to emanate from his very core. "Returning to the gate is an excellent idea. In fact, I insist upon it. I believe a few members of the Global Air executive team will want to meet the flight crew personally. You see, what you don't know is that as of 9 a.m., yesterday, I am the new chairman of the board of this airline. And this," he said, gesturing around the cabin, "has been the most illuminating customer experience I could have possibly imagined." The silence that followed Julian's statement was absolute. It was a dense, heavy void that sucked all the air out of the first-class cabin. The low hum of the engines, the gentle clinking of glasses in the galley, everything seemed to fade into nothingness. Richard Sterling's triumphant smirk froze on his face, then slowly melted away, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of utter disbelief. Mia's face went white, the color draining from her cheeks as if a plug had been pulled. She stared at Julian, her mind frantically trying to process what he had just said, searching for any sign that it was a bluff, a desperate lie. But there was none. There was only the unshakable, profound calm in his eyes. Captain Frank Marshall was the first to recover, though only just. His 30 years of training of being the ultimate authority in any situation had not prepared him for this. That's not possible," he stammered, his voice losing its steely command. You're Dr. Julian Hayes." Julian supplied calmly, as if introducing himself at a cocktail party. My appointment was to be announced to the public on Monday morning. I was flying out for a preliminary meeting with the West Coast operations team. I booked the flight under my own name because I wanted to experience Global Air as a regular passenger, not as an executive getting the red carpet treatment. And I must say, he added his gaze, sweeping over the captain, then Mia, then landing squarely on Richard Sterling. It has been an extraordinarily educational trip. The jet, which had been inching forward in the takeoff queue, came to a sudden halt. Through the window, Julian could see they had pulled off to the side. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, not Captain Marshall's but the first officer's, sounding strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We are experiencing a minor operational issue, and will be holding our position for a few moments." The operational issue was standing in the first-class aisle, and he had just detonated a bomb in the middle of their careers. Captain Marshall swallowed hard. He looked at Julian, truly looked at him for the first time, not as a problem to be managed, but as the man who now held his future, and the future of the entire airline in his hands. He saw the intelligence in his eyes, the quiet power in his posture. He saw the expensive, understated quality of his clothes that he had previously mistaken for cheapness. His entire perception of the man shifted in a sickening lurch. "So, Mr. Chairman," Marshall began, his voice barely a whisper. I had no idea. I was just trying to—" "You were trying to find the path of least resistance," Julian finished for him, his voice devoid of anger, which was somehow more terrifying. "You made an assumption, and you acted on it. You sided with a belligerent, prejudiced passenger against another passenger who was being harassed simply because one of them fit your profile of who belongs here and the other one did not. You chose to discipline the victim. That's not de-escalation, Captain. That's dereliction of duty." He then turned his attention to Mia, who looked as if she might faint. "And you," he said, his voice soft but cutting. "You are the face of this airline. Your job is to provide exemplary service and ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers. Instead, you acted as Mr. Sterling's accomplice. You validated his prejudice. You insulted me with your condescending offers to move, and you failed in your most basic duties." Finally, his gaze fell upon Richard Sterling. Sterling, who had built his world on a foundation of wealth and privilege, looked utterly broken. His face was a pasty, sweating mess. The bully had been stripped of all his power, exposed and humiliated in front of an audience. "And you, Mr. Sterling," Julian said, though he no longer even looked at him, instead directing his words to the captain. "Is it standard global air policy to allow passengers to racially harass others, to violate FAA regulations by standing during taxi, and to threaten fellow travelers, because your crew seemed to think it was?" Before the captain could answer, a frantic call came over his radio. He listened for a moment, his face growing even paler. "Yes, I understand," he said into the radio. He's right here." "Yes, sir." He looked up at Julian. "The tower has a message for you, Mr. Chairman, from Mr. Davies." Robert Davies was the outgoing CEO, the man who had personally courted Julian for the chairman position. "They're asking why Flight 287 has aborted takeoff and is returning to the gate," Marshall said, his voice trembling slightly. Julian held the captain's gaze. "Tell them," he said, his voice ringing with quiet authority, "that the new chairman is conducting an unscheduled on-site review of in-flight personnel and customer service protocols." As the plane slowly, shamefully began to turn back toward the terminal, the young man in 1A who had been filming finally lowered his phone, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. The other passengers were whispering the full, seismic reality of what they had just witnessed finally dawning on them. When the jet bridge reconnected to the aircraft with a solid thud, the door was opened, not by the crew, but by a grim-faced airport official. Standing behind him were two figures Julian recognized immediately: Robert Davies, the CEO, his face a mask of controlled panic, and Sarah Jenkins, the head of the legal department. They had clearly been scrambled from an executive lounge nearby. They boarded the plane, their eyes immediately finding Julian. The sight of the CEO and chief counsel striding into the cabin confirmed the unbelievable truth for everyone present. Robert Davies walked straight to Julian. "Julian," he said, his voice low. "My God, what happened?" Julian stood up, his tall frame seeming to fill the entire cabin. He looked past Davies at the disgraced flight crew and the cowering Richard Sterling. "What happened, Robert?" Julian said, his voice clear enough for everyone to hear. "Is that I just discovered the rot in this company isn't just on the balance sheets. It's at 30,000 feet." 3 days later, the atmosphere in the 50th floor boardroom of Global Air's corporate headquarters was thick with a mixture of expensive cologne and palpable tension. The sprawling room with its panoramic views of the city skyline was designed to project power and stability, but today the 12 board members seated around the polished mahogany table looked anything but stable. They shifted in their high-backed leather chairs, murmuring in hushed tones the news of Flight 287's aborted takeoff and the subsequent incident having ripped through the company's upper echelons like wildfire. They knew the basics, but the details were still the subject of wild speculation. At the head of the table sat Dr. Julian Hayes. This was his first official meeting as chairman. He was no longer in his travel clothes. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a simple dark blue tie. His presence was a study in contrast to the ornate room. He was calm, focused, and radiated an aura of control that unnerved the other members who were more accustomed to the back-slapping old boys club style of the previous chairman. Outgoing CIO Robert Davies, seated to Julian's right, cleared his throat and began the proceedings. "Good morning, everyone. As we all know, this is Dr. Hayes's first meeting as our new chairman. Julian, on behalf of the board, welcome. We look forward to your leadership." A polite, if strained, round of applause followed. Julian acknowledged it with a slight nod. "Thank you, Robert. And thank you, members of the board." He began, his voice filling the room steady and measured. I had intended for my first address to be about third-quarter projections and fleet modernization strategies. However, events of the past 72 hours have compelled me to address a far more urgent, and I believe far more corrosive issue. He paused, letting his eyes travel around the table, meeting the gaze of each director. "I'm talking about our corporate culture, specifically the culture that our passengers experience every single day." An uneasy silence settled over the room. This was not the expected talk of profit margins and stock prices. "This company is bleeding," Julian continued. "We are bleeding money, yes. But more critically, we are bleeding prestige, customer loyalty, and our reputation. Our stock is stagnant. Our customer satisfaction scores are at an all-time low, and we are being beaten by more agile, more customer-focused competitors. We have been trying to fix this with financial engineering and cost-cutting measures. We've been treating the symptoms. I am here to tell you that the disease runs much deeper." He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "This weekend I took a flight, JFK to LAX, as a regular full-fare first-class passenger. I wanted to see what Global Air is really like without the executive polish. What I experienced was a masterclass in systemic failure." He proceeded to recount the entire incident from the gate to the cabin. He didn't use an angry or emotional tone. Instead, he narrated the events with the cold, dispassionate precision of a pathologist describing an autopsy. He laid out every microaggression, every biased assumption, every procedural failure. He did not, however, use any names. He referred to the participants only as a high-value passenger, a flight attendant, and the captain. The high-value passenger. Julian explained, felt empowered by his status to question and harass another customer. Why? Because our culture has taught him that his money buys him the right to dictate the experience of others. The flight attendant, he went on, chose to placate the aggressor rather than protect the passenger being targeted. Why? Because our training and incentive structures prioritize the appeasement of frequent flyers over the uniform application of our own codes of conduct. And the captain, he said, his voice dropping slightly, when faced with a clear violation of safety and company policy, chose to punish the victim to achieve a quick, superficial peace. Why? Because the culture from the top down has signaled that resolving a problem quickly is more important than resolving it justly. He sat back, letting the weight of his words sink in. The board members were silent, stunned. They were used to sanitized reports and filtered data, not this raw first-hand indictment of their company. This single incident, Julian concluded, is a microcosm of our larger problem. The arrogance, the complacency, the inherent biases, they are baked into our operations. It's in how we train our staff, how we handle complaints, and how we define premium service. We've created a system where employees feel the need to profile passengers and where certain customers believe they are above the rules. This isn't just bad service. It is a massive ticking liability. Finally, a portly director named Michael Theron, head of the audit committee, cleared his throat. Julian, this is deeply concerning. Shocking, in fact. Have the employees involved been terminated? It was the classic corporate response: find the bad apples and remove them. Julian looked at him. Termination is the easy answer, Michael. And in this case, it would be the wrong one. Firing a few individuals doesn't cure the disease. It just makes us feel like we've done something. The flight attendant and the captain are not just individuals. They are products of the culture we as a board have allowed to fester. They acted in a way they believed was aligned with the company's unwritten rules. He turned to Robert Davies. Robert, I have the preliminary reports on my desk. The flight attendant, Mia, has 18 years of service with only minor citations. The captain, Frank Marshall, has a spotless 30-year record. But a deeper dive shows something interesting. Captain Marshall has been flagged internally 3 times in the past 5 years for abrupt conflict resolution in the cabin, all of which were dismissed. Mia has received numerous commendations from high-mileage flyers for her attentiveness. But there's a corresponding pattern of complaints from less frequent or minority passengers about dismissive treatment complaints that never made it past a regional manager. He had done his homework. The room was silent. So, no, Julian said firmly. We are not simply firing them. We are going to use this as the catalyst for a top-to-bottom cultural overhaul. Starting Monday, I am commissioning an independent company-wide audit of our training complaint resolution and employee incentive programs. Every single policy will be re-examined through the lens of equity and customer safety, and it will be led by my office. He then looked directly at the CEO. Robert, I also need you to arrange a formal hearing. I want to meet with Captain Marshall and flight attendant Mia, along with their union representatives, within the next 48 hours. I want to hear their side of the story. In person. The message was clear. This was not going to be swept under the rug. This was going to be the first lesson of the new chairman's tenure, and the entire company was now the classroom. The meeting was held in a sterile, impersonal conference room on a lower floor of the corporate tower, a world away from the opulent boardroom. This was not a space for power lunches and strategic planning. It was a room for difficult conversations. On one side of a long, unassuming table sat Captain Frank Marshall and flight attendant Mia. They were flanked by their respective union representatives, a stern-looking lawyer for the pilots' union, and a weary but sharp-eyed rep for the flight attendants. Both Marshall and Mia looked pale and exhausted. They had been suspended with pay pending the investigation, and the past 2 days had been a blur of uncertainty and dread. On the other side of the table sat Julian Hayes. He was alone. He hadn't brought the CEO or the head of legal. He wanted this to be a direct conversation, not a corporate tribunal. A single tablet lay on the table in front of him. "Thank you all for coming," Julian began, his tone neutral and professional. "I want to be clear about the purpose of this meeting. This is not a termination hearing. This is a fact-finding discussion. I have read the official reports, the witness statements, and your service records. Now I want to hear from you." He looked first at Captain Marshall. "Captain, I'd like to start with you. Walk me through your decision-making process from the moment you were called out of the cockpit." Marshall cleared his throat, his usual confidence completely gone. "Mr. Chairman, Dr. Hayes." "Sir, I was informed by my lead attendant that there was a passenger dispute causing a disruption. My primary concern always is the safety of the flight and maintaining schedule. When I entered the cabin, I saw a tense situation. I had one passenger, a known frequent flyer, who was agitated, and another passenger, you, who was refusing a crew instruction." "Let's be precise, Captain," Julian interjected calmly. "I was not refusing an instruction. I was declining a suggestion from flight attendant Mia to move my seat. When you arrived, you turned that suggestion into a command. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." Marshall conceded, his eyes downcast. "My goal was to de-escalate. I believed that separating the two parties was the quickest way to achieve that. I made a judgment call." "And on what information did you base that judgment call?" Julian pressed. "On the information from my crew and my own assessment of the situation," Marshall replied. "And what was your assessment?" Marshall hesitated. I assessed that asking you to move to an equally comfortable seat was the most efficient solution." "Why me?" Julian asked the simple, devastating question. "Why not ask Mr. Sterling to move? He was the one who was verbally abusive. He was the one who violated FAA regulations by leaving his seat during taxi. By any objective measure, he was the disruptive party. So why did you ask me to move?" The captain was silent for a long moment. The union lawyer shifted in his seat, but said nothing, knowing his client had to answer. "Honestly, sir," Marshall finally said, his voice cracking slightly, "it was the path of least resistance. Mr. Sterling is known to be difficult. I thought asking you would resolve the issue with less fallout. Less fallout for whom, Captain?" Julian's voice was sharp. "For you, for the airline. You weren't protecting the cabin. You were protecting yourself from a complaint by a wealthy passenger. In doing so, you sided with an aggressor and failed to protect a passenger who was being subjected to harassment. Do you understand how that constitutes a catastrophic failure in your duties?" Marshall could only nod, the shame evident on his face. "Yes, sir. I see that now." Julian then turned his gaze to Mia. "Mia, your turn. You've been with this airline for 18 years. You've handled countless disputes. Why did you immediately side with Mr. Sterling?" Mia clasped her hands tightly on the table. Mr. Sterling is a global diamond member. We are trained. Our performance reviews are partly based on feedback from our highest value customers. He looked upset, and my first instinct was to make him happy. Even if making him happy meant insulting and demeaning another passenger, Julian asked. I didn't see it that way, she stammered. I just saw a potential problem and I tried to solve it. When you showed me your ticket, I thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't, Julian said. You then offered to move me. Why was my presence in my assigned seat making Mr. Sterling uncomfortable? Mia flushed. He implied as much. I thought a change of scenery might calm the situation. Did you ever once consider telling Mr. Sterling, your high-value customer, that his behavior was inappropriate? Did you tell him that questioning another passenger's right to be in first class was against company policy? Did you remind him that he was creating the disturbance? Not me. No, Mia whispered. I was afraid of how he would react. He's known for filing complaints. So you were more afraid of a complaint from him than you were of failing to do your job correctly, Julian stated. It wasn't a question. He then tapped the tablet in front of him. I have here the file on Mr. Richard Sterling. In the last 3 years, he has filed 17 official complaints. 12 of them were to get compensation for minor delays. 3 were about the brand of champagne being served. But two of them are interesting. Both were complaints about unprofessional crew members who had asked him to store his oversized baggage or to stop speaking loudly on his phone during boarding. In both instances, the flight attendants received a formal reprimand on their record. The system taught you, Mia, that standing up to a man like Sterling was career suicide, and it taught Captain Marshall that appeasing him was the safest bet. He looked at them both, their faces etched with a dawning, horrified understanding. They weren't just on trial. The entire corporate system that had shaped their behavior was. This is not all on you, Julian said, and for the first time his voice softened slightly. You are symptoms of the disease I spoke about in the boardroom. But that does not absolve you of responsibility for your choices. He leaned back. So here is what is going to happen. You are both being placed on a 90-day administrative leave. During that time, you will not be flying. You will be heading up a new task force with our HR and training departments. Your job will be to help design from the ground up a new conflict resolution and de-escalation training module. A module that is based on justice, not just speed. One that teaches our crews how to protect all passengers, not just the ones with the most miles. You are going to use your own mistakes as the primary case study. Both Marshall and Mia looked up, stunned. This was not the firing they had expected. You will be paid your full salary, Julian continued, but your return to active duty is conditional on the successful design and implementation of this new program. You have a chance to fix the system that led you to fail so spectacularly. I believe in redemption. But it must be earned. Do you accept these terms? Captain Marshall, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope and profound respect, nodded vigorously. Yes, sir, absolutely. Mere tears welling in her eyes could only manage a choked, yes, thank you. Good, Julian said, standing up. Your work starts tomorrow. As he walked out of the room, he left behind 2 chastened employees who had been given something far more valuable than a job, a chance to right a wrong, not just for themselves, but for the entire airline. The reckoning had been delivered not with a sword, but with a blueprint for a better way forward. The 90 days that followed the hearing were a whirlwind of transformative activity within Global Air. Julian Hayes did not just talk about a cultural overhaul, he became the driving force behind one. The task force, led by a humbled but re-energized Captain Marshall and Mia, worked relentlessly. They weren't just ticking boxes in a corporate mandate. They were on a mission. They interviewed hundreds of flight crew members, reviewed years of complaint data that had been previously ignored, and brought in outside experts on implicit bias and equity training. The result was the Global Standard Initiative. It was a revolutionary new training program that was rolled out to all 20,000 of the airline's flight attendants and pilots. It moved beyond simple customer service platitudes and delved into complex, real-world scenarios. It empowered employees to stand up to abusive passengers, regardless of their status, and gave them clear protocols for doing so without fear of reprisal. The new system also flagged passengers with a history of frivolous or abusive complaints, ensuring that crews were aware of potential issues before they escalated. Julian made sure the message was clear from the top. The safety, dignity, and equal treatment of all passengers and crew were paramount, trumping status and miles every time. The changes were not just internal. Julian launched a new marketing campaign with the tagline, "Global Air where everyone is first class." It was a bold statement, and he backed it up. He invested heavily in upgrading the passenger experience across all cabins, not just the front of the plane. Customer satisfaction scores, which had been in a nosedive, began to slowly but steadily climb. Wall Street took notice. The airline's stock, stagnant for years, saw a healthy bump as investors gained confidence in the new chairman's clear vision and decisive leadership. Julian was proving that a company could be both profitable and principled. Throughout this period, one loose thread remained: Richard Sterling. Julian had deliberately set the matter aside, wanting to fix his own house first. Sterling, for his part, had gone completely silent. He hadn't filed a complaint. He hadn't flown Global Air since the incident. The man from Seat 1A had posted his video of the initial confrontation, and while it didn't go massively viral, it circulated enough within business circles that Sterling's name became associated with the embarrassing episode. The public humiliation for a man like him was a punishment in itself. But Julian knew that true accountability was still pending. About 4 months after the incident, Julian was in a meeting with the head of corporate accounts, a woman named Eleanor Vance. They were reviewing the airline's largest contracts. As she scrolled through the list of top-tier clients, a name caught Julian's eye: Sterling Innovations, Inc. "Sterling Innovations," Julian said, holding up a hand. "Hey, tell me about them." "Oh, they're one of our biggest," Eleanor said, tapping her screen. "A $7 million a year account. They're a tech logistics firm. CEO is a Richard Sterling. We handle all their domestic and international executive travel." Julian felt a slow, cold sense of satisfaction. It was the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. "Their contract is up for renewal next month, correct?" he asked. "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "It's usually an automatic renewal, a formality. They've been with us for over a decade." "Not this year," Julian said calmly. "This year I'll be handling the renewal negotiation personally. Please schedule a video conference with Mr. Sterling for next week, and make sure the termination clause of our corporate partnership agreement is ready." A week later, Richard Sterling's face appeared on the large screen in Julian's office. He looked thinner, more haggard than Julian remembered. The arrogant bluster was gone, replaced by a forced, nervous smile. He clearly had no idea who he was about to speak with. The meeting had been set up by his assistant with the office of the chairman. "Good afternoon," Sterling began, his voice oozing a practiced corporate charm. "Richard Sterling here. I was told the chairman's office wanted to discuss our contract renewal." Julian leaned forward into the camera's view. "Hello, Richard," he said, his voice calm and even. We've met before. The recognition on Sterling's face was instantaneous and devastating. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking ghostly pale against his expensive office backdrop. He looked like he had seen a phantom. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. I believe our last conversation was on Flight 287 from JFK. Julian continued, his voice unwavering. You were concerned about the integrity of the first-class experience. Well, I'm the man in charge of that integrity now, and I've been reviewing our corporate partners to ensure they align with our new company values. Dr. Hayes, Mr. Chairman, Sterling stammered, his mind racing. I am so sorry. That was a terrible misunderstanding. I was having a bad day. It was not a misunderstanding, Richard. Julian cut him off, his voice hardening. It was a clear demonstration of your character. Our new corporate code of conduct, which applies to all our partners, explicitly states that we have a zero-tolerance policy for harassment, discrimination, or abuse of any kind, whether directed at our employees or fellow passengers. Your behavior on that flight was a flagrant violation of that code. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. Sterling Innovations has been a lucrative account for this airline. But we are building something new here at Global Air. A brand built on respect. And our brand is not for sale. We are not a company that rewards bullies. Please, Sterling pleaded, his voice cracking. It won't happen again. We've been a loyal customer for 10 years. Think of the business. I am thinking of the business, Richard, Julian said. I'm thinking of the millions of customers who deserve to travel with dignity. I'm thinking of my employees who deserve to work in an environment free from abuse. Your $7 million is a fraction of the value I place on our integrity. As of the end of your current contract, Global Air will no longer be doing business with Sterling Innovations. My legal team will be in touch to formalize the termination. We wish you the best of luck in finding another carrier. With that, Julian reached forward and ended the call, plunging Richard Sterling's horrified face into darkness. The ultimate karma had been delivered, not in a heated confrontation, but with the quiet, devastating finality of a terminated contract. Julian leaned back in his chair and looked out the vast window of his office. Down below, a Global Air jet was gracefully ascending into the sky. He watched it until it was just a speck, a symbol of the new direction he was charting. It was a new horizon, not just for the airline, but for every single person who would ever step on board one of its planes. The journey had been turbulent, but the destination was finally in sight. That's the powerful story of how a moment of ugly prejudice became the catalyst for a corporate revolution. Dr. Julian Hayes didn't just win an argument. He rewrote the rules. He proved that true leadership isn't about power, but about principle. The story shows us that one person's refusal to be diminished can send ripples that transform an entire system, turning a moment of humiliation into a lasting legacy of respect and accountability. It's a reminder that karma isn't always instant, but when it arrives, it can be as decisive as a cancelled multi-million-dollar contract. What did you think of Julian's ultimate response to Richard Sterling? Was it the perfect consequence? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment. Thank you for watching.